All right, good morning, everybody. I'm so happy to see so many faces this morning, and we're going to talk about some pretty important stuff today. So, we're going to talk about interviews and secondaries, which I know for some of you are going to be coming up very, very quickly. And you still have a lot of things you need to do before we get to that, secondaries and interviews. But it's really good to have just a conceptual framework for how to approach these things before you jump into the process. And then for those who are applying next cycle or further out, this is good stuff to keep in mind as you're still gaining experiences and thinking about the questions that we've talked about throughout MedPrep. What is the value that you bring to medicine? And so I'm going to jump right in. I'm going to share my screen. And as always, if you have questions, I would really appreciate it if you simply raised your hand or unmuted yourself or post in the chat. Doug will be monitoring the chat, so he'll be able to interrupt me if there are some questions that need to be addressed. So we're going to go all the way back to the beginning of MedPrep. On the very first day, I remember I showed you this chart and I really emphasized thinking about the question, what is the value that you bring to medicine? And the reason why I think that this is such an important question, more important than why medicine, is because at the end of the day, you are selling what you bring to the table to the schools. There are, for a lot of schools, thousands of applicants, and except for maybe the handful of people who are just there because their parents are making them be there, most of those people are there because they genuinely, truly, passionately want to be doctors. And so the desire and the passion alone, while necessary and appreciated, is not enough to get you into med school. You can't say that you want to be a doctor more than anyone else on this earth and expect that that's going to work to get you in. And so they are, you know, the baseline expectation is that you want to be a doctor. The real question is, why should I pick you? Right? So if they're trying to pick people out of 6,000 applicants, why should they pick you to be have a seat in their school? And so that has to boil down to, what can you do for me? If I'm a med school, I'm asking that question, right? What can you do for me as a med school? What can you contribute to our school? What value do you bring to us? What insight, what reflection, what perspectives do you bring to our school that's going to help us in some way, whether that's sitting around a table with your peers and forming a conversation, whether that's serving our community through our community service projects or our research or our student run clinics. Maybe in our clinical rotations, you are part of an underrepresented group, and you're going to bring a much needed representation to a population that isn't currently receiving culturally appropriate care. There are many ways that you can bring value to a school, but it's your job to tell them what those things are and how those apply to the schools. And so this is the place in your secondaries and your interviews. That's where you get to directly speak to the schools and tell them. So school, you have these really awesome things, and it just so happens I also have these really awesome things. I have these attributes and these competencies that can help you or can add value to this really awesome thing that you're doing at your school. And so before you even start on this journey of addressing secondaries and interviews, and I would even argue you probably want to do this before you get to your personal statement, is sitting down and really brainstorming, what is the value that you bring to medicine? And I'm going to stop you right now if you're thinking in your head that the value that you bring to medicine is passion, empathy, hard work, dedication. Those are all baseline expectations that I would argue 99% of the people are going to bring to medicine. And so you really, really have to dig deeper and unpack other things about you that are very practical in a way that you can help people, a community, a school, you can help something in your future. So we're talking about skills and competencies and attributes, so personal attributes about your own background and who you are as a person. And so I would encourage you all to start by just sitting down and brainstorming all of the elements of your life and sort of like um, data mining your life. So you've got to pull out some data. So what are some experiences you've had in your life that you can extract and then synthesize and apply to this question? What is the value that you bring? And so this could look like, well, I grew up in a household where there was a lot of um, substance abuse. And so I have this insight about why people might abuse substances or what life is like in a house where substances are being abused, what the family might experience. I've seen that firsthand. And so I have an idea about that. Or maybe you belong to the LGBTQ community and you understand personally the challenges that that community faces when they go and visit a doctor. So that's the perspective and the insight that you have. That's the value that you bring. And so I want you to think through all the things in your life that you've seen and you've experienced, and I want you to start making lists and or writing it out. This is how I can help the world based on who I am as a person. So once you have those thoughts in your head or you have them written out on paper, then we're going to use that stuff to form the answers to our questions going forward. All right, so we're going to start with
Joanne, can you pause for just a moment? It appears there's an issue with the link on the website.
okay.
There might be two versions of that link. So let's pause for like 2 minutes, 3 minutes till I can get that updated so we can get some more people in here.
Yeah, no problem. While we
But
wait, does anybody want to ask any questions about what I had just said? Does that make sense to everybody, or do you see any concerns with anything I just shared? Everybody's like, totally, I get that. I love it. I'm gonna do that. I can totally think of
I
all
think
the ways. Go ahead.
so my question is, so do most people, like most of the 6,000 or so people, not do this? Is that why it kind of stands you apart, or is it
Yes.
kind of a luck of the draw?
No. Well, so both. Allie, I would say that the majority of people who apply to med school do not take this approach. They take the very typical approach of going for the I want to be a doctor, and I'm going to tell you 3 to 4 stories in my personal statement. And at the end of each story, I'm going to tell you that this made me want to be a doctor even more. And they just
Mm,
repeat 4 or 5 times over and over in their personal statement. And this really made me dedicated to being a doctor. This really inspired me to want to be a doctor. And so it's not really saying anything new. It's just telling me I did some things and then saying again I want to be a doctor. So it's just like constantly declaring. It's like almost screaming at me, right? If I'm a reader and I'm trying to figure out if I should accept you, it's like you're screaming at me, I want to be a doctor. And I'm like, I get it, right? I get it.
right.
You took the MCAT, you took OChem. Nobody does that for fun. You did everything you needed to do to get to this place. I get you want to be a doctor, but you've got to tell me why I should pick you.
Mm,
And just wanting it really bad is not enough.
right. Because everybody else does, except for, the
Exactly.
people who feel like there's no other choice.
You can't say you want it more than the other people.
Hmm.
That's ridiculous, right? I used to joke when I worked at the med school that it would be much easier for us if we just ran med school admissions like the Hunger Games. Just put all the applicants outside the door and just be like the first 100 that get in, that's it, right? How easy would that be? It'd be pure passion. Um, but that's not real, that's silly. And that wouldn't make sense. You probably wouldn't want those people as doctors anyway, right? The most
Right.
competitive people. You really want people who, um, well, and this is what the med schools get to do, right? They don't have to fill a class. This isn't undergrad admissions where they're like desperate to fill their seats. They get to create a class that looks any way they want. So they get to hand select whatever people they want that are interested in different paths in their future, that bring different perspectives and values to the school, that have different competencies, different skill levels. They get to craft this class that is diverse in so many different ways. And that's the luxury that they have.
Hmm.
Now, will you appeal based on whatever it is you share to them? Will you appeal to every single school when you apply?
No.
Absolutely not, right? That's why you apply to 20 or 30 schools because you might get most people if they get 5 interviews, they're happy, right? They're good. So that means 25 people didn't like you. 25 people decided to push hold on you or worse. And so that's normal. To think that you're going to appeal to everybody or every school is not realistic. I have never seen anyone get 20 interviews. I've seen people get 12 or so interviews, but never, the entire application. So the idea is to try to present to the schools an accurate portrayal of what you bring to the table based on your life experiences so they have a really clear understanding. Then what they get to do is they get to decide how you fit into their puzzle, right? This puzzle that they've created of this class they've created. How do you fit into that? Now, you can't make them decide that you fit into that. You either do or you don't, and it's tiny bit subjective, and that the person reading your app has the power to make that decision. But beyond that, you don't have a lot of control. But I would say that if we're thinking about who's reading your apps, the people who are going to be sitting there reading, most people, I remember when I used to divvy out apps to screeners, I would divvy out 40 apps at a time. I'd give 40 apps to each person. And these are all doctors. So they had lives, right? They had their full-time job, they had kids, they had their research, they had everything they were doing, and they just volunteered to be on this committee. They didn't get paid to do it. And they were doing this work on the weekends at nights after they got off work. They were tired. I had to beg them to do it. I had to follow up with them multiple times. Some of them did it really quick. Some of them, would sit on their 40 apps for 2 weeks. And they're tired when they read your app. And they read 40 at a time. So imagine what 40 pre-meds might possibly write in their personal statements. Think about, of those 40, how many are going to default to the basic, I want to be a doctor. So I shadowed somebody, and that made me want to be a doctor even more. Then I wanted to explore this. So I went and did this clinical thing, and that really confirmed that I wanted to be a doctor. And so then I went and I did this other cool activity, and by God, you won't believe it, but I still want to be a doctor after doing that. And after reading like 30 of those, they're just like, oh, I can't. Like it's so like I don't know how to explain it, but it's physically exhausting to read the same thing over and over. So then when you get this really refreshing person who goes straight to the point. Yep, I say in my intro, I want to be a doctor. That's your thesis statement. I want to be the kind of doctor that provides culturally appropriate care to patients. Oh, cool. Now you actually know what kind of doctor you want to be. That's cool. You've thought about it. So how do you do that? Why do you think you can do that better than everyone else who's done this? Well, I know that I've seen some things in my life that have given me some insight. So now I understand that when I go to do this, I want to do it this way. You're not saying other people did it bad. You're just saying, I want to do it this way. So now they're like, okay, well, that's pretty cool. That's interesting. I've seen that done by other people. That works. And then you keep going. And so they get interested in you. You're refreshing. You're just using a different approach. You will stand out simply because they won't have the same kind of physical reaction to reading your stuff that they just had with this, 30 people before you. Um, and it answers their question. So why should I pick you? Because you'll probably be good at this. You've thought about what you want to do. You understand the value that you bring. You've already thought through. You've self-assessed, um, and you're giving them what they're looking for. You're giving them those competencies because they're really there to measure those competencies. Are we good to go, Doug?
I think so. I didn't find any issues with the link on the webpage, although that's where I think people were having troubles, but the link on Facebook is working.
So we'll keep going. All right. So what I was talking about mostly right now or prior was the personal statement, the approach to the personal statement. So we're going to switch gears and go back to secondaries now. So just some technical information before we get into the questions. So the secondaries are approached very differently between AMCAS and ACOMAS. And I know most of you are going to be applying to both MD and DO in the same cycle, which is very normal and a good thing. So when you are thinking about when to submit things and when to do things, I know that's a big question for MD and DO. The secondaries actually play a big role in how that process is done, because AMCAS will not send you any secondaries. Most of the schools won't send any secondaries until after you're verified and after your MCAT score is released. So you can submit in June and it'll take 4 weeks to get verified. So you'll get they don't release information to the schools until the end of June at the earliest. And then in July, like the first 2 weeks of July, you should expect to get all your secondaries by email. The COMET, however, has their secondary questions embedded in the primary application of COMAS under the school-specific questions. So there is a quadrant, a fourth quadrant that is program materials, and that's where you'll find the school-specific questions for the secondaries. And so the reason why this is so significant is you are going to be slowed down significantly by that with a COMIS, right? Because you might be filling out your application, but you haven't written all the essays for the secondaries. And so it's a little unrealistic in my mind to think that you're going to submit a COMIS in May or June, all of them, because you haven't, you're going to have to write all those essays. And that takes a lot of time. So personally, what I would do if I were in your shoes, if you are applying to MD and DO, is I would go ahead and open up both AMCAS and ACOMAS in May. I would get them filled out, all the technical information, and then I would submit AMCAS as soon as you can and submit a COMIS with just one school on your list. So pick one that has the least, number of questions, the easiest questions to answer, get it submitted, and then you'll get verified. You don't have to submit any, either AMCAS or COMIS, with all of your schools on your list when you first submit. You can submit with just one school in each, and that will start the verification process. For AMCAS especially, you want to start the verification process early because it can take 4 to 6 weeks. And so you don't want to sit there waiting to create your school list or anything like that before submitting. So pick a school, submit it, get it out there. And then for a COMIS, while you're being verified, so remember I said it takes 4 to 6 weeks to get verified for AMCAS. So nothing is happening. You are literally sitting around doing nothing. At that time, you could go back into a COMIS and you could be filling out one school at a time and getting those secondaries submitted. You could also be, while you're doing that, you are actually writing the secondaries for your AMCAS because many of the questions are very, very similar, and we'll talk about what those are. And so you could be getting a head start on your AMCAS essays so that they're all the writing to the major questions are done. You've drafted it, you've had people edit it, it's good to go. So as soon as you start getting your secondaries in the middle of July for AMCAS, it's like the first, second week of July, all you have to do is start tailoring those secondaries to the schools that you add to your application, and you can move along much, much faster. What you don't want to do is submit your AMCAS and then go on vacation for 4 weeks and not touch this stuff and then just start the whole process from scratch in July. That would be really, really challenging. So I really encourage you to not take any vacations the summer that you're applying. You really need to be home in front of a computer and have access to an advisor and be able to just work on this stuff and get it done and get it looked at frequently. It's a lot of writing. It's extremely overwhelming. So people will get, if you apply to 20 schools, you might get, 15 emails in one day from 15 different med schools with 15 different usernames and passwords. And you might think, oh, that sounds actually pretty cool. I'd love to get 15 emails from med schools. But in my experience, the people who get those emails, and if you apply to more schools, you'll get more emails, they actually respond in one of two ways. Some of them, they freak out and they just go in and they just start filling everything out like really quickly because they're just like, oh my gosh, I have so much to do. I have to get this done right now. And then the other kind of person, which I think is more common, is they see all those things coming in all at once and they panic and they can't move. They're literally like debilitated. They cannot move. They don't know what to do. They can't make a decision. They don't know which ones to do first. And so they just do nothing. And that's really problematic because I've had people who I knew were applying and I haven't heard anything from them. So I'll follow up. I'll be like, hey, I haven't heard anything. And they're like, yeah, I was a little embarrassed. I haven't touched my secondaries in 2 weeks. I don't know where to start. And that's happened. I have had that happen so many times over the past 6 years. I can't tell you how many times that's happened to me. And that's really common because it's just really scary. This is the most scary part of the process because it's real, right? Like once you submit this application, they're going to look at you and they're going to make a decision about you. And you've spent 4 years building up to this moment. And now, finally, once you hit submit on that button, that's when the truth comes out, right? That's when they're going to make that decision about you. And for a lot of people, that is so scary and they just can't, like, it's like they can't move forward because they're afraid of what's going to happen. So that's called self-sabotage, and it's extremely common. And if you want to be successful in this cycle, you're going to have to get control over yourself in that way. And if you start to identify that feeling of avoiding getting stuff done because you're afraid, or maybe you might not realize you're afraid, you're just avoiding getting stuff done and you'll attribute it to many other things. It's a form of self-sabotage. You're going to have to call yourself out and push forward, or you will sacrifice this cycle, which I don't want to happen to anybody. So once you get all of those emails in your email, you're going to need to get organized fast. You already have your Excel sheet with your school list, so you're going to have a column where you enter in your unique username and password for every single school. And then what I want you to do is open up every secondary and look at it. And I want you to we're going to put our secondaries in categories. So we're going to have a category for this is super easy. This is like yes or no questions. I could do this in 5 minutes. And there are some secondaries like that where they don't ask you any essays. They just ask you to answer questions. You give them $100 and that's your secondary. So we're going to put all of those in a category. You're going to color code those as like easy, right? And then you're going to look at all of them. And then there are going to be some where you notice that the 4 to 5 questions that they ask are all very, very similar. And for those, I want you to put all of those in one category. You're going to put all of those at the same color. And then there are going to be some like really wacky ones like USC, where they're going to ask you all kinds of interesting questions that seemingly have nothing to do with anything else. And you're going to put all of those kind of ones that are going to require a little bit more thought and time in a different pile. So most people think that you should submit secondaries by your interest in the school. So I should obviously do the ones that I want to go to the most. Well, unfortunately, you wanting to go to that school the most is not does not have anything to do with whether you're more likely to get accepted at that school. And so what if you were trying to get into med school, what you want to do is you want to get those secondaries submitted early so that they actually read your application and consider you for an interview. So the race is not when you submit your primary, the race becomes when you submit your secondaries because everyone can submit their application in June. But I'm telling you, the psychological trauma of getting all those emails and trying to submit your secondaries, and hold on, let me back up. Submit the secondaries written well. There's a big difference. You can submit secondaries fast, but those people who don't try and don't do what I'm about to tell you how to do this will more than likely fall through the cracks because again, with their personal statement, they're going to approach this in a very cliche way. They're going to say the same thing they all do. Those who don't get help will say the exact same things on their essays. And once someone reads the same thing 10 times, those people are not going to get picked. So you want to take your time and do this really well so that you don't fall through the cracks. You actually catch their attention. So we're going to put our secondaries in those links and those groups, I mean, and here's the strategy that I would recommend. So I would recommend as soon as you're done grouping them all, go back, get your credit card out and submit all of the ones that are going to take 5 minutes or less. Just get them done. Fill them out, pay the $100 and knock them all out before you start writing anything. Because then you can change the color on your spreadsheet to complete. You are going to love that color. So pick a color for your complete and love that color because you're going to love seeing when that color shows up on your spreadsheet. As soon as you start to see that some schools are complete and they're in the hands of the med schools, you're going to feel fear and relief. You accomplished something. You got it done. That's progress. Progress inspires people. So when you get something done, you're going to want to do the next thing. So the next group are going to be the people who are going to ask you, I'm going to come back to this. Remind me to come back to SJT and Casper. Are going to be the ones that are going to ask you questions like, how do you contribute diversity to our school? Tell us about any challenges that you've overcome. Um, why us? Um, you know, kind of touching upon some of the more basic concepts that we're really used to. And I'm going to go through a lot of questions in a few minutes. So when you notice that these are the same kind of questions, like how do you contribute diversity to our school, which is asked in about 10 different ways, you are going to write that answer and you're going to be able to just take that main answer that you have and then plug something in about each school, tailor it to each school, and then you'll be able to knock that group of secondaries out fast because you have all those essays done. All you have to do is put the bulk of the writing in all of them and then go back in and tailor each one with a sentence or two about each school. And once you get that done, then boom, you have like, 5 to 10 done already. You can hit submit really fast on all of those. And then the ones like Vanderbilt or UC San Diego, which ask you to write an autobiography, or USC, some of those, like I said, are kind of a little bit more intensive. You're going to have to spend some time on that. You're going to want to get some help with those. You're going to probably make several revisions, which is fine. And you could start touching those earlier, but you're going to realize that you probably are going to touch those longer because they're just a little bit more unique. And so that's my strategy is try to get them done as fast as you can without, I mean, if you really feel strongly like I want to be considered at Case Western and I have to get that one done because I love that school, then by all means, like make yourself happy, do it. It doesn't matter to anybody which schools you do first. But I'm only telling you this if you feel very overwhelmed when you first get that wave of emails in July, which you don't know what I'm talking about yet, but when July comes, you're going to be like, ah, yes, that's what Joanne was talking about. I understand now what she was saying. Okay, so this kind of just summarizes what I was talking about. We are always going to tie every secondary to the school if it's okay. I shouldn't say always, that's too hyperbolic. Whenever it's possible, we are going to speak to them. We are going to understand who that school is. And I talked a lot about this in the Creating Your School List workshop. So if you haven't seen that one, go back and watch that. But we're going to speak to them because when we're writing a secondary for, let's say, Drexel, can anyone tell me some elements about Drexel that you might want to touch upon in your secondary? Lori, I'm going to go through some secondary questions in a few minutes. Does anybody know anything about Drexel? Can tell me what you would talk about with Drexel? Or at least have an understanding of them? Would you talk about rural medicine with Drexel? Yes or no? This is the interactive portion of the presentation. No, that's a guess. Okay. But that's a problem, right? Like, let's say, Madeline, you applied to Drexel and you were writing their secondary. You would want to know something about them, right? Ali, you said they have a women's health education. So Courtney knows they're in Philadelphia, right? So Drexel is in a very urban environment. Drexel also has, they do a lot of work with the underserved, those experiencing homelessness. They're very much centered around the community. So they have a very community aspect. They don't necessarily care a lot about research. So if every secondary answer was tied back to your research, but you spoke nothing about any work that you've done with any underserved communities, then you would more than likely not catch their attention, right? But if you have both research and work with underserved communities, and you know Drexel does this stuff, then you deliberately choose to talk about those experiences. That just makes sense, right? So you have to know the schools in order to speak to them. You talk to them as if you understand them and you know what they're looking for. So you have to tailor all of your secondaries based on who the schools are and what the schools would want in their student body. Is that making sense to everybody? I hope so. Okay. Um, I'm going to go back really quick because I don't know why I put this in this order anyway, but we'll get this over with. So you probably have heard of SJTs and Caspers. Caspers was the, it's been around for quite a while now. It is a situational judgment test. However, the AAMC decided that they wanted to create their own situational judgment test, and they literally call it the situational judgment test. A situational judgment test in concept is just a test that judges how you respond to various situations. So they are designed to not just simply test your ethics, but also test just generally like your decision making or your thought process behind certain situations. So they are going to be, yeah, they're going to present a situation to you. And then for the situational judgment test, it's all multiple choice. So you pick the best answer. For Casper, it's a little bit more dynamic. They have both written answers and they have verbal answers. Both SJT and Casper have very robust websites with a lot of sample material on their websites. And you should go to their websites and you should download their books and you should look at their books and make sure that you have not only an understanding of the types of things they're going to be asking you so you can think about it, but also just make sure you've figured out the logistics because some of them require, like the Casper requires a webcam. I think SJT also requires a webcam. They are going to be watching you to make sure that you don't get up and walk around, that you're not looking off at something, and so you are going to need to get all that organized. Which I know you all have webcams, so you just have to like make sure that everything is in order for that day. You have the time to finish it. You're not going to be interrupted. All of those things. And for these, I know people feel really scared and compelled because you want to be prepared. But this isn't something you really study for. This isn't contents, right? You're not going to memorize how to do the answers to these questions. These are questions about how you think about things. So, how do you, at the ripe age of 23 or 22 or 24, however old you are, suddenly decide that you are an unethical person and you make bad decisions when it comes to helping people and you generally wouldn't do the right thing under certain circumstances? Like, how do you suddenly just change that up and decide you're going to be a different person? You are either already built in terms of like making the best decisions about certain situations, or you probably are not. I'm guessing most of you are. I'm going to go back and answer some of these chat questions in just a minute. I just want to finish this thought. So there's not really studying. This is sort of like, how do you think about things? How do you make decisions? What would you do, sort of things. So what you want to do is try not to overthink this too much. Think about what you would actually do. These are designed to get at your, I guess, morality, not morality in the sense of religion, just your morality in the sense of like, would you do the right thing, or um, would you do the ethical thing? So this is a really, yeah, I tend to like simplify this to sort of explain like the purpose of these from a med school point of view is to identify those people who present really well. Sometimes they have pathological issues, like they might be a sociopath, or they present really well, they know how to present to society, but deep down, like under the surface, they don't like internally have the right thought process or the right decision making. They actually might want to cause harm to people. And so they're really trying to identify those types of things in people, people who might be racist, people who might just might not be coming from the right place. And so if you know that's not you, if that doesn't apply to anything I just said apply to you, then more than likely you're going to be just fine. All right, let me go back and answer these questions. Do we need to take both? Does it depend on our school list? Yeah, so I would take Casper. Most schools, I mean, based on most people's school list, Casper is going to come up. And so you can go ahead and register for Casper. I would say do Casper during that verification time, like around June. But since a lot of people do that, you want to check the dates early. If you can't find one in June, then just do it as, whenever it makes sense for you. But that time period after you hit submit on AMCAS before verification is a really nice time to get some of this stuff taken care of because it's kind of quiet during that time. So you could do Casper. I would plan to do Casper 100%. SJT depends on the 5 schools that are offering it. And so, my goodness, I literally just posted what they were the other day, but it's UC Davis. If you're in California and you're going to apply to all the California schools, you're going to need to take SJT. So also keep in mind for SJT, it's not required, but I personally would do it if they're recommending it. Like for example, at UC Davis, I would go ahead and do it. SJT is free. Casper is not free. You do have to pay to send your scores to the schools for Casper. So when you make your school list, it might be nice to see which ones require Casper, and that way you'll just have an idea of how much you're going to have to pay when you release those scores. Are they required? I think I said that. They're Casper, I would do, and SJT is optional. No, Casper is getting more and more to the point where it'd be very hard at this point to make a school list with most of the major schools that people apply to without Casper. SJT gives you a score. Casper does not give you a score. No, you don't physically send anything. This is all done online. And the schools, you have to release the scores to the school. So SJT scores will go automatically to the 5 schools that are using it. Casper, you have to send directly. You have to send it to the schools. And once you get in there and you take the test, it's going to be very easy for you to figure out how to do that. It's pretty user friendly. No, they're completely different tests. You can do them, you have to register through different sites. A simple Google search, Casper, SJT test, they'll come right up. It's not hard to find out how to do this. I would do it during June if you can. If it's already booked up and you can't do it in June, then do it as early as you can in July. You can technically do it now. I mean, registration is open. I mean, you can register now and get the earliest date you can if you want to get it over with. Before you do it, though, make sure you look at the books and just have an idea about what you're about to do. How does the school rank you if Casper doesn't have a score? Well, the schools get your score. You don't get your score. So the schools can see your score. That's cool, huh? I will say this though, Casper's been around, it's been increasing over the past 6 years. And so I've been at UC Davis for 6 years. And so students have been taking Casper the whole time I've been there for 6 years. And our acceptance rate has only gone up over 6 years. So we've raised our acceptance rate, 5% over 6 years, which is pretty significant for med school acceptances. So clearly Casper hasn't held our students back. It's not that this is a prohibitive test it's not the MCAT, it's just a test about your decision making. So unless you're extremely nervous about your decision making skills, you should be fine. But if you know you're a good person, you make the right decisions, most of the time in most situations, you should be okay. I wouldn't worry about this too much. Look at the questions, and if you really, really are looking at the answers and you're like, I have no idea what I would choose to do, maybe talk about it with somebody. But again, think about it from the perspective of what would I do, not what is the right answer here, because I'm not even sure there is a right answer. I think it's more about just understanding your thought process and how um, you would make decisions. Okay, so are we ready to move on? Are we good with that? Madeline, for Casper, they don't care about type, like you do have to type fast. That is a thing. Yes, you could be relatively worried about that, but I would say they don't care about like grammar or anything related to spelling. As long as you can get your ideas down, you should be fine. You don't have to stress about it being typed perfectly. So again, the med schools don't see your answers. They only see the score that Casper generates for them. Okay, so back to secondaries. Take a peek at this. There we go. So we're gonna kind of break down some questions. I feel like that's the best way to talk about secondaries. And then if you have questions, obviously keep them coming. So the number one question that almost every school will ask you is the top one. How do you bring diversity to our school? And again, they are coming up with some pretty clever ways to ask this question. But if you think it's a diversity question, if you're reading a question, you're like, I think they're asking me about what is the value I bring to the school. That is a diversity question. So the whole question I keep pushing at you is like, what is the value I bring? That is basically me asking you, what can you do for us? What is the diversity you bring? So replace diversity with value, and there you go. That's the answer. So your diversity is what can you do to help us? What perspective, what do you have in you? What ideas, what thoughts, what experiences, what attributes, what competencies that you think are different than what 99% of the people in our applicant pool are looking for. So when you're thinking about how do I bring diversity, again, if your first thought goes to empathy, compassion, passion, hardworking, any of that, stop, 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 stop. That's not what they're looking for. That is not bringing diversity to a school. You can't say your research is bringing diversity to their school. You can't say you had the most amazing clinical experience ever, and that's bringing diversity to their school. That is absolutely not what they're looking for. So diversity is blending what you've seen in your life with what you've done, with who you are, and generating a value statement about how all of those things synthesize into a perspective that you have that can help people in your future. Does that make sense? I wish I should have made like a visual for this. I'm picturing these little, these circles where, okay, my childhood, where did I come from? What did my parents do? What did I see as a kid? Did I grow up in a privileged neighborhood, or did I grow up in an underserved community? Did I grow up working a lot? Did I witness a lot of abuse or alcoholism? Like, what did I see as a kid? My background with who I am. Am I white? Am I black? Am I older? Am I younger? Um am I an immigrant? Have I lived here in America my whole life, but my parents immigrated, so I have that perspective? Did I move a lot as a kid? Was my dad in the military? What things about, well, actually, I kind of deviated back to my childhood. What attributes about you as a person? Am I part of the LGBTQ community? Am I Muslim? Am I Hindu? Those things, like, how does that help the world in terms of being able to speak multiple languages? So you take all that stuff and you kind of blend it with your background, your where you came from, and then you look at what you did in college or beyond, and what did that add to your plate in terms of what you're able to do? That's where you normally gain your skills, right? So now I'm able to translate medical terminology. Now I'm able to scribe really fast. I'm able to, as an EMT, I learned the importance of, calming people down when they're stressed. If I worked in hospice, I have a really valuable end of life perspective. Um, think about how can you extract what you learned from your experiences and pair that with everything else. Doug, did you have a question?
So, Sori asked a question earlier and it has a follow up here, which I think is a good time to bring it up.
Okay.
Because earlier she'd asked a question related to the personal statement, and
Mhm.
now I think this is relevant here. Would seeing experiences of close family members or friends directly impacted by the ethnicity they are in healthcare as both patient and care provider be meaningful insights? I should mention I'm also part of this ethnicity group. And then the follow up she had was, how is this question different from how we are approaching this in our personal statements?
Yep.
So I
So,
think,
yeah, that's a great
it's
question.
personal statement versus secondaries. When do you bring it up? I guess maybe.
Yeah. So in your personal statement, you are telling stories from your experiences that are leading into a competency or some value that's like you're going to have 3 to 4 very specific things that you can do really well. And so those are very competency focused. Your diversity statement very much can overlap with some of the things you said. Like, you can't expect you're going to be a completely different person and write that you're not going to say anything similar to your personal statement. That's impossible. So on some level there's going to be some overlap in the concepts that you're presenting, but this is going to be a different piece of writing. So the diversity statement could range from 1,000 characters to 500 characters to 2,000 characters. I mean, you're going to have to take whatever you say about yourself and either shrink it down or expand it depending on the school. But this statement is a really concise, direct statement about the perspective that you bring. So in your personal statement, you wouldn't just like declare this about yourself. You would tell a story that leads us into that understanding, and then you would tell us how that relates to medicine. If they're asking, how do you bring diversity to our school? They're saying, tell us directly, what is it that about you? You're like, it's kind of like your disadvantage statement. You're just directly stating, based on, having grown up in blah, blah, blah community, watching this, seeing this, doing these things, I can do these things for the world. You're kind of extracting everything about you. Again, it's not that different from your personal statement. You're just approaching it differently. Does that make sense? You're gonna find that a lot of the questions will have you repeat information from your primary application, and that's going to be really frustrating to you because you're going to say, like, I just wrote all this, why am I writing this again? That's a great question. I don't know why they're having you write it exactly again. I know for some schools they use the secondaries to divvy out information for different interviewers. So for example, we're going to talk later on in a few minutes about blind interviews versus open interviews. In a blind interview, they don't give the MCAS application to the interviewers. They don't know anything about your metrics or anything. So for some people, some schools, I think they actually have you rewrite some of the answers to your primary, because they just basically create a nice package with the information that they want from you, and then they just give that information to their interviewer so that the interviewer sees only what the med school wants the interviewer to see about you. So in that case, you're like literally like kind of recreating your application for their purpose, if that makes sense. which for you is annoying because you're like, I'm just writing my application again. For them, it's helpful because you're doing that work for them because they don't have another way to extract that information from your primary to give it to their interviewers. Okay, so we'll keep going. I know that could we copy and paste portions of our personal statement? No, you should not use the literal same piece of writing. You need to rewrite it in different words. They read the secondaries at the same time as your entire application. The secondaries are usually embedded as one application. So they'll read your personal statement, then they'll read your secondaries, then they'll read your experiences, then they'll read your letters of rank. In most cases, that's how they do it. Okay, next question. Tell us about a personal challenge you have faced. Okay, so the challenge slash adversity question is going to come up in a lot of different forms too. And you've got to be able to read a question and figure out what it is that they're measuring in you quickly. If you're not sure, ask somebody. But generally, an adversity slash challenge question, it could be one of two things. For some people who have experienced significant adversity in their own life, maybe they experienced abuse as a child, or their parents, like I said, had either a substance abuse or a mental health issue and they lived in the household. Maybe they were bullied a lot as children. Maybe you immigrated later in life and just moving to America, learning English and all of that was a challenge. There's a million different challenges. So if you have something like that, I think that this is a perfect place to tell that story. If you haven't, like, if you feel like you've already said it exactly the way you want to say it in your disadvantage statement, then just like start out by like summarizing again what the problem was, but then focus more on like how you overcame it, because in your disadvantage statement you're more than likely didn't talk a lot about that overcoming it part. You just said what it was. So here you get to focus on like, this was the challenge I lived with and this is how I worked to go past it and how it affected me in a positive way. And then for those who maybe didn't experience significant life challenges, it's perfectly okay to talk about how, when or where you did experience challenge and how you pushed through it. So that might look like, I was doing a research project and I completely botched the entire batch of data. I had to start from scratch. It was, I was really disheartened, and then just talk about how you pushed through that. It could be you broke your ankle and you had to be in a wheelchair for 6 weeks and commute across campus. And, you've got to do a good job of like actually showcasing how that affected you, not just focus on what happened. And then how you overcame it is more about what's in your head, right? It's like, um, how did you cope? How did you talk to yourself? How did you make decisions? And so you really want to showcase like your thinking and your just how you talk to yourself about pushing through that. If you have different types of personal challenges, how do you choose one? You can kind of summarize them, if you can summarize them all in like a sentence or two at the beginning, like just like for example, having moved a lot as a child, um, or you can just state it like, my family moved a lot as a child, so we bounced around a lot. Later in life, this happened. And then again, I don't know. I kind of feel like now that I'm saying this, it probably would be better it says, tell us about a personal challenge. So it probably would be better to focus on one personal challenge, Catherine or Kathleen. So maybe pick one that you haven't talked about in the rest of your application and dive into that one. Yeah, I think I'm backpedaling on my first response. I would pick one and go into that in more detail. Um, Yes, you are going to have word limits. They're going to vary drastically. There are some secondaries where they literally give you 200 characters, which is a sentence basically. Um, and then some are going to give you 2,000. Most aren't going to go beyond like three. Most of them are not going to be as long as a personal statement. Although some have, some do give you 8 to 10,000. I highly recommend you do not write 8 to 10,000 characters. Nobody wants to write that much. So I would stick to, 2 pages at the most. Holly asked, would a car accident be a bad idea? No, I don't think that's a bad idea. I think it's just a matter of how it affected you.
Um, Joanne, there was another question earlier that was, is this a place where we might bring up a mental health situation?
Yeah, you can definitely. It's okay to talk about mental health in your personal statement. Like if you experience anxiety or depression or an eating disorder, I would say that what they're going to be looking for is demonstration that you have thrived living with that disease. So if you've always had depression and you're medicated now, or you're getting therapy, or however you've learned to cope with that, you've got to show on paper, which is honestly in your grades, that you've been okay with that. If you had C's and D's up to your last quarter of college and you're saying, um, well, I had depression, but now I'm much better, they don't have any evidence that you are better, right? It's just, they're just going to take your word for it. So if that's like, let's just say hypothetically, that's the situation, I would say you're going to have some trouble because you probably need to take some courses after those C's or D's and show that you are in a good place and capable of taking three science classes and getting A's in them. Um, if you have an upward trend, if your grades are not an issue and you talk about those mental health concerns, then it shouldn't be a problem, as long as you bring it full circle and you end with, this is how I have thrived with this. This is how I cope with this. And it may or may not come back. I mean, that's normal for things to flare up in the future, but you know how you cope, you know how to take care of it and get back on track fast. Is the adversity you experienced If the adversity you experienced is related to diversity you bring, oh, adversity, how would you answer those two? So the diversity you bring is not a challenge you faced. It's what you bring to the table. So I think that they could be related, but if you're using your diversity statement to say, like, let's say, for example, your your parents use drugs, and so you grew up pretty independently because your parents were disengaged from your life. That's not, I bring diversity because my parents did drugs. Like, you don't get into med school because your parents did drugs, right? You are going to say, having grown up with parents who use drugs, I have a perspective of how um, substance abuse impacts not only the patient but the family, and I also have a broader understanding of how to approach substance abuse in practice. And so you might want to share what some of those insights are. That would be example of the value that you bring or the diversity that you bring. Your adversity would be, I grew up with parents who use drugs, and therefore I pretty much had to take care of myself at a young age. As a result of that, I developed maturity and high degree of responsibility very early. Not only did I take care of myself, I took care of my siblings. And while it was really difficult, the way I pushed through that was knowing that the help I gave to my siblings was making a big difference in their lives, and I knew that I didn't want to end up like my parents, and so I pushed. I did these things. Can you see, Howard, the slight difference in what I just said? It's okay to say no. You do. Okay. So it's the diversity is the value, right? It's pinpointing what you can do for the world based on something that you experienced. And the challenge is, it's kind of similar, I guess, in the sense, like, I faced this challenge, but this is how I overcame it. So, like, how did you cope with that? And yes, please do not write about the MCAT or OChem or other bad grades in your challenge statement. Some schools will ask you, is there anything else you want to tell us? And that's an okay place to talk about academic challenges. Although, let me just warn you that if you got a B in something and you're telling me that's your challenge, that's a major red flag. Most people don't think B's are a bad grade. So please don't talk about B's as being a challenge, or being concerned about it and needing to explain that to them. If you have one C, same thing, you're normal. Like, don't go into a lot of like detail explaining why you got the C. Nobody cares. If you have a whole like year's worth of C's and D's and you have a significant downward trend or a dip, you probably do want to explain what happened that year. That's okay. But we're not going to just say, like, I got it, OChem was really hard for me and I got a C and I had to repeat it like that. They don't care about that. That's not worth bringing up at this point. Okay. So kinds of questions like, how can this school prepare you for your goals? Or in the future, you'll see, like, why the school. This is where you get to speak to them directly. So this is where you name very specific things about their school. You say, well, the problem-based learning environment will enable me to be able to apply the scientific concepts directly to clinical cases, which will prepare me better for the boards, which are all clinical in nature. It'll also help me improve my communication skills and my ability to explain difficult concepts to others. And so I would really love to be in this type of learning environment where I can not only collaborate with my peer group, but I can push myself to understand the direct application of science. That would be, how does the school prepare you for your goals? That means you understand their curriculum model, right? But you can do that about a lot of things. You can talk about their clinics. You can talk about the hospitals you'll rotate through. You can talk about training in an urban environment or a rural environment, if that's the case, if that's what your goals are. So you have to first kind of give them an idea what your goals are, not goals, but like just give them an idea of like why that matters to you. Can med schools see our individual grades in each class? Yes, they can. On your academic record, you're going to list every class you've ever taken at every single school. Even if you repeated it, you have to list it, and they can see everything from beginning to end. Now, most of the time, they don't read across. They're not going, line by line looking at every class you took. They look at the list of grades, they scroll, their eyes scroll from top to bottom to see what the trend looks like. So if it's really bumpy in the beginning, they quickly move past that. They go straight to the bottom and they look from the bottom up to see if you have an upward trend. If you have, like lots of C's and D's in your first couple of years, but then their eyes go right to the bottom and you have a really thick chunk of A's at the end, they're fine. They don't have any concerns about you because you figured it out, right? Whatever happened at the beginning of your college career is not what's going to get you in or keep you out of med school. It's what happened at the end of your college career. And so, but let's say hypothetically you have C's and D's at the very end. Just being honest with you, that's going to be really problematic for them because that's the time when you're closest, when you're going to them. They have no evidence that you are ready to handle um, the upper the coursework. What happens if you have a decline GPA, but the science, oh, no problem, Tao, that's not what I'm talking about. If you're above a 3.5, you don't have anything to worry about. I mean, unless you have C's and D's in your very last quarter, you're fine. Okay, trust me. What if you have C's in your senior year, but you took a postbac? So look at the last year of your grades. So all the grades are listed in chronological order. So if your postbac is, you did really well in your postbac, that's the point of postbac, right? It's to add on another year of grades. So hopefully your postbac is really good. That's what they're looking for. Like I said, they're not going across and seeing like when you took it or what you took. They're just looking to see. Now, when they get to the bottom and they see that chunk of A's, they will move over to the left and glance to see what classes they were in. And they would expect to see science classes in those A's. So if you took a whole year and you took like communications classes, they're going to say like, what's this person doing? Like, why did they take a whole year's worth of communications classes and get A's? That's a little, it's a little sketchy. So they'll go up, they're like, when's the last time this person took a science class? And then if the last time you took a science class, you got a C, that's problematic, right? Because then they think you're kind of trying to game the system. And it just shows you didn't really handle, like you couldn't handle your very last science class you took. And if that's the case, then they're so worried, right? They're gonna be like, well, if you got a C in your last science class, what's gonna happen when we throw you in 20 units of science in med school? They're worried about that. Oh, Skylar, don't be stressed. You're good. You're totally fine. Okay, moving on. Discuss any elements of your app that you might be concerned about. Yep, that's what I'm talking about. So you can talk about anything that you want to talk about here, like dips in your GPA or a low MCAT score. I always wonder, what can you possibly say about a low MCAT score? All you can say is that this MCAT score doesn't represent your true ability. But again, it's like, what evidence do you have about that? Like, you're just saying it, but it doesn't, like, how, it's just sort of like helping you, I guess. I think this question is more designed for you to help you get some things off your plate so you feel better. I'm not sure how helpful it is to the schools unless you actually had a real situation like, well, you'll notice in the fall of my second year, my grades dipped down really low. That's because I got into a car accident and I was out of school for 3 weeks. And then they'll go, oh, yes, well, that makes sense now. Now we understand why the grades were lower in the quarter. That's what you would use that space for. What if an applicant had no red flags in terms of GPA? Well, that's great. Don't say anything. If you have nothing for them to be concerned about, then leave it blank. You don't have to make up concerns. Please don't. If your grade drops due to a death in a family, do med schools require? No, no, no. And honestly, they're going to be a little concerned about that because unless it's like your mother or father, because people in your life will continue to die throughout your entire life. I promise. That's kind of what happens. And so every time someone dies in your family, are you going to have to take some time off and like take a break from school, or not go to your clinicals? That kind of stuff might be concerning to them because, like I said, that your family will continue to get older and sicker, and they will continue to die. And so you're going to have a lot of things come up in your future. You're going to have to figure out how to push through that. And that sounds really insensitive when I say that out loud, just when I realized. But I'm just trying to think like from a med school perspective. Like if you're in your middle of your studying for the boards and your great aunt so and so passes away, you're going to have to keep taking your boards, right? You can't just not take your boards. So I don't know. I think I would just be careful about how you present that. Do you have a connection to Northern or Central California? Please explain. That's a common question that all schools will ask. Like if you're applying to a school in Michigan, they'll ask you if you have any connections to Michigan. And here's what I would say. Most of the time, the answer is no. For a lot of people, they don't have connections to the out of state schools unless you do. And if you do, that's great. Like if you have a relative in the state, you could say, although I've never actually been to, Detroit, I have been to Michigan several times. My family lives in wherever. Doug would be able to say better. And so I have a general idea of what the geographic region is like, and I really appreciate how diverse and urban the environment is because I think I'd really thrive in that community. You can also talk about if you haven't been and you really don't know, you can do a lot of research about the community and draw parallels between the community and places you have lived. So, for example, you could say, although I haven't ever been to Kansas City, I've done a lot of research and it looks like the population of Kansas City is very similar to that of Sacramento. And then say things about Sacramento that you understand is going to help them understand that you understand where you're going, right? Like you want to paint this picture that you do know um, what you're getting yourself into. That's not exactly the point of the question, but I would say, doing that might be better than just saying no. Um, that's what I've always advised in the past. As long as you don't go like too far with it, you're just saying like, I don't have any connections, but I think I have a pretty good sense of where it's at and what it's about. For UC Riverside, if your mom grew up in the inland area, can I work that? If you went and visited her, if you've been there, I would say it's more about like your insight about what it is that you're why you're going there. The reason why they're asking that question is, well, first they're trying to identify if you like have any relatives. I think they usually ask that if they care, but they're really trying to identify if you would be willing to stay there and work. Most state schools or anybody who asks this question usually has a mission to produce physicians who will serve their communities. So if you are so uninterested in their community that you can't take the time to look it up and understand what they're about, and you just say, no, I don't have any connections to Michigan, then it might be kind of off putting because you're like, well, you couldn't even take the time to learn about us or to figure out, if you do have a connection to us in any way. Like for example, let's say you speak a second language. Let's say you speak Vietnamese, and then you look up the city where the Michigan school is, and you notice there's a large Vietnamese population. You could actually say like, while I haven't been to Michigan myself, I did see that such and such city has a large Vietnamese population, and I would be thrilled to be at your school and do volunteer work at the blah blah community or clinic where I hope I could do some outreach to that community using my language and cultural skills. Okay, going back up to Lisa's question, if you're from a really rural town in Northern California, yeah, that's a great thing to talk about. I think that that's really important, and there are a lot of rural communities in America that are very underserved. And so, whatever insight you have about rural communities, I would definitely bring that up. And especially if you are interested in serving in a rural community in the future, there are a lot of med schools that have rural medicine tracks, and so you might actually use that if that's the case for you. If you want to go back, is to look up those schools that have rural medicine tracks and apply to those because you'll be more appealing because of where you're coming from. Some schools consider certain Asian populations underrepresented, but the AMC currently does not. But it doesn't mean that you won't be considered underrepresented for specific schools. You can look at specific schools' websites to see. I don't know if I don't know how much worry I would give to that matter. I would focus on presenting the value that you bring as who you are and not try to analyze what your chances are based on some kind of formula or something like that based on underrepresented status. You will get it, all of you can get into med school, no matter what your background is, based on how well you answer these questions and how direct you are and how clear you are about what you can do for them. And they have space for everybody, regardless of what your background is. In terms of race, they're not going to have a quota system in the sense of like, oh, you're from an overrepresented group, therefore we can't accept any more of you. That doesn't make any sense. They will accept whoever they want based on what they can bring to the table. All right. In what medical specialty are you interested? Ah, yes. So there is this big myth out there that you should not talk about what medical specialty you want to go to. This is really different than what I say to my college freshmen. So I do actually stand in front of a room with college freshmen, 18-year-olds, and say that you should not be declaring that you're going to become a surgeon. I might even say that to you a little bit, only because you don't get to pick surgery, right? Surgery picks you. You don't get to say, I'm going to be a surgeon. It all depends on if you get into a surgical residency. However, there are some specialties that are a lot more accessible than others. So if they ask you directly, what specialty are you interested? Notice the word interested. It doesn't say which specialty will you become in your future. It's a good place to give them an idea of what your values are right now. So let's say you are interested in either surgery or plastics or something like that, and it's very competitive. Then them knowing that about you, it's not that they are anti-surgeons or anti-plastic or anything like that. It just gives them an idea of like, okay, so this person's coming in, they want to be a surgeon, and so we'll have to like, make sure we align them with some experiences in med school that will help them on their residency path. It also just helps them know that the entire class of people they're accepting isn't going to go into primary care. I mean, every school wants to have people go into diverse specialties. It's really good for the school when they have a lot of diverse specialties represented. If you have no idea what you want to do, that's okay. You could say things like, if you have an idea you want to work, like Lisa said, I don't know what specialty I want to go into, but I do know that I'm going to go into rural medicine, whether I work in an ER or I'm doing primary care or family care, or maybe I open up a small dermatology practice in a rural community. I know that whatever I end up doing, I want to be in a community that is generally underserved, in a rural community. Maybe you want to work with children, but you don't know if you want to be a pediatric surgeon or just a pediatrician, not just a pediatrician, but you know what I mean. Um, you can just talk about populations you want to serve or regions you want to live in or something like that. You could say, I know I want to go into academic medicine where I want to be able to do research and teach alongside having a clinical practice. So if you know crystal clear you want to go into primary care, there's no harm in saying you want to go into primary care. Just be as specific as you can about sharing what that vision looks like in your head. You can talk about whatever you want as long as it's clear as to the second part, why it is that you want to do that. So I think I'm running out of time today. I talked a lot. I guess there's a lot to talk about. So I'm gonna kind of go a little bit quicker through some of this stuff. Doug, if you want to interrupt with any questions, um, how would you approach this question? Yeah, I'm gonna kind of skip those for now because I think those are really, really specific to individuals. Those are kinds of questions where we can address that when we get to the secondaries. Like, for example, if you're using HPA when you're writing your secondaries, we'll address that when we get to you. I don't want to, not that I don't want to answer your question, it's just that we're running out of time. So I want to kind of save these really, really specific ones for when we get to that point.
So just you have 17 or so minutes left, so you got some time.
But I still have to go through interviews.
Oh yes, okay.
Yeah, not so much time. Okay. So for an autobiography, Vanderbilt and UCSD are the only ones right now that I know of that ask for an autobiography at about 5,000 characters. And this is your life story. This is from beginning to end, the things about you that you want a school to know. So I like to visualize a rock skipping over a lake, skip through your life and touch upon the things that matter. You don't want to spend a quarter of it talking about how you were in Girl Scouts. If you were in Girl Scouts through 12th grade and that was really important to you, get through it in like 2 to 3 sentences tops, because there's going to be a lot of things about you that you're probably going to want to share. And you can tell some stories, but we're talking about birth to present here. So try it out, see how long it is if you talk about all the things. Usually I find that we have to about a lot of things. So that's something you might want to practice with if you have some time on your hands now. Go ahead and start writing your autobiography if you know you're going to apply to one of those two schools. How, if you could present yourself to the committee, what would you want them to know? That's a common interview question too. So just like talk to the committee directly. What would you say to them? That's not different than the diversity statement or the value statement. So oftentimes they will ask, not every school is going to obviously ask all of these questions. So you can use the same answers to different questions. So for example, if you wrote a really good diversity statement about the perspective you bring, and they don't ask a diversity question, but they ask a question like this, you can use that question and just tailor it to this answer. If I could speak to the committee, I would tell them that I bring a unique perspective and then say what that is. Is there anything else you want to tell us? I feel like we answered that already. And then why should we accept you? That's similar to the one I just covered, which is like, what would you tell an admissions committee? Oh, if you get this question, if you could tell the admissions committee anything, what would it be? The answer is you should accept me. That's what you should tell them. You should accept me to your med school because, and then make a case for yourself, because I bring some value to you, because I can do something, because I'm, um, you know, I have some skills in some area. Do not tell them they should accept you because you had a really cool research experience or because you were a scribe or because you did student run clinics. Like just telling them you did experiences is not going to impress them. It needs to be focused on what's in your head, not what did you do and what's on your resume. So you can use the experiences as evidence to support the claim you're making about yourself, but just telling them you did things is not going to work because the things you did are not going to impress them. They have read thousands of applications over decades. Everybody has done stuff. So you can't, you've got to back up and stop relying on your resume to get you in. You've got to think about who you are as a person and what thoughts do you have in your head. How are you valuable to them based on what you can do, not just what you did with your time? The things you did with your time definitely informed what's in your head, though, right? Okay, so that was a lot. Any questions before I switch gears and go over to interviews? And I apologize. I'm gonna have to go through interviews pretty quickly too, I think. Any last questions? Feel free to unmute yourself. All right, give me a thumbs up if you're good. Need to know you're still there, still listening. Everybody good? All righty. Take that as a yes. Okay, so interviews. That's fun. Um, you want a lot of interviews, right? Like we shouldn't be afraid of interviews. You want to get interviews. And so we're going to be excited about interviews. There are generally four ways that schools interview, and Vita is a new way. That's the video interview that the AMC created. Not every school requires Vita, but enough of them are now that you will more than likely end up doing a Vita. And what Vita is basically the school generates, or not this, actually, I do think it is school specific. So the system, the computer program, generates a question and they put it on the screen, and then you record yourself answering that question. Usually there's 3 or 4 questions, and then the school gets that video of you and they can use that. They use it in different ways. Most schools are not using Vita to substitute their own interviews. Most schools are using Vita as another tool to pre-screen. So, for example, if you are unable to form a thought and answer a question in your Vita, probably there's a low chance you're going to get a real interview. If you are able to answer a question, you hear a question, you think of what they're asking you, give them an answer, you support it with evidence. That's what you're supposed to do with a question. Then it's just a screening tool, right, for your ability to communicate. Some schools are using Vita after the fact if they're having a hard time deciding between applicants on their interview days or based on their interview scores. They may rely on Vita as a secondary tool to like make a decision. Like, okay, well, they did much better in their Vita versus, this other person. So we don't actually know for every single school how they're using Vita. I wouldn't spend a lot of energy worrying about that. Just do it the best you can. And I, you're also accustomed to being on screen at this point. You're going to have to get outside of your head, not overthink this, and just perform. It is performance for less than half an hour, And yeah, oh, Tal, that's a great question. I am absolutely unsure how med schools are proceeding with interviews, but based on the medical community's, continued recommendations of us social distancing, I'm guessing that the medical communities are not going to want to bring a bunch of people from all over the country to their states. So I'm guessing interviews will be online again this year. Um, just thinking about who the people are that are interviewing you, doctors. Do you think they're going to want to sit in the enclosed space with people from all over the country and then go out and work with patients? I'm guessing not, right? So let's plan on doing virtual interviews this year, I'm guessing. I'm not an expert on that. Okay, so for these situational questions, oh, they're flying in. Let's see, what are these questions? For these situational questions, how long, they'll tell you exactly how long the answers should be. They're usually less than 10 minutes. I want to say like 5 to 8 minutes. Are there certain things that we should completely avoid saying? Um, yes, unethical things. I'm not sure I have like a list of things to not say necessarily, but I think you can practice. And if you get practice with a professional, the professional will help you screen out some things that you shouldn't say. You should always get help on these things, right? Like none of this process is intuitive. And I'm glad you're all here today. And I assume you are the type of people who get help when you are doing things like this. But you think about this, like how many people out there don't get help? How many people just try to figure this out on their own? And they're the ones, unfortunately, who oftentimes don't make it through the process because they do make some really basic mistakes. So if you get help with an advisor and you're screening out some answers that are a little questionable, you'll be able to work all that out. Don't worry about that today. Okay, so there are, besides the Vita, you're going to have your typical traditional one-on-one. That's where you're sitting in a room with another person, a virtual room. And with those kinds, there's typically two approaches to the interview. Sometimes people will come out of their interviews and say, oh, that was so easy. It was so conversational. And what that means is that the interviewer just looked at your application and wanted to talk about it. So they'll ask you some questions about, oh, why did you choose to do this? Or, oh, you did this. Tell me more about that. And, it's really nice. And you just get to talk about yourself. And so those kinds of interviews are really just trying to gauge your conversational skills, your interpersonal skills, and they're just trying to get to know you better. Those are super easy and nice, and they're hard to prepare for. You just have to be a good conversationalist. The behavioral interviews are the ones you need to prepare for. And these are the ones where they will ask you questions that are designed to get you to sort of disclose how you reason through a problem. And they're trying to get inside your head and understand how you think about things. And so I'll read off a couple of examples of like behavioral interview questions. And you can think about why, like, how are they behavioral in nature? So here's one. Describe an effort you undertook to proactively identify your own weaknesses or areas of opportunity. So a behavioral interview is looking at, tell me about a time when you did something. So they're saying, describe an effort you undertook. And then they want to see, how do you think about things? So tell me about a time when you did this thing. And then how did you respond to it, or how did it turn out, or how did you change? And so they want to know, how, tell me about the time, how did you reason, how did you decide, and then how did you assess yourself, and then what happened, and how does that relate to your future? So you've got to always tell them that you understand the point of a question. So we would actually start the answers to these kinds of questions like diving right into a story. And when they say, like, let's say they ask you, describe a situation in which you had to overcome a problem in order to move forward. Okay. You wouldn't start your answer with, well, there are many times when I have to just, overcome a problem to move forward. I'm going to tell you three of those and then I'll dive. No, you would just start with the story. Well, one time when I was in, third grade, and don't go back to third grade, I'm just teasing. But that one time when I was doing this thing and you set it up and you describe the background, that should take like a minute or two, and then present the problem, and then talk us through how you reason through that. Show your thinking about it. So I really had a hard time just deciding whether I should do this or this. In order to decide, I took these things into consideration, and then ultimately say what your decision was, and then reflect on that, and then say, um, I think there are going to be many times in my future where I'm going to have a problem that I'm going to have to overcome it in order to move forward, especially in medicine. And I think the best way to approach that is just tackling it head on. Avoiding the problem is never going to help me now or in my future. And so this experience really taught me that not to avoid problems, to go straight for them. And it's going to help me both in my clinical practice and we're working with peers. And so you kind of tell them that you understand why they're asking this question. You understand how it applies to your future. And that's a really nice wrap up and close to a question like that. So there are lots, I mean, there's millions of behavioral type questions. You'll never know exactly what they're going to ask you. But if you think about being confident about all the experiences you've had in your life and being able to pull from any of those memories that you have, it's a skill set. So you don't need to like try to find a list of questions and just drill through them for the purpose of memorizing answers. That's a terrible way to prepare for interviews. The best way is to practice enough to develop a skill so that no matter what question they ask you, you can demonstrate that skill over and over. So the skill is think of a story, tell a story, tell me why you understand that's relevant to your future, tie it back to medicine if you can. Um, and so it's sort of that just that habit of doing that same format over and over. Um, and then it doesn't matter like for MMIs especially, you can literally use the same story in 2 or 3 stations because they don't talk to each other. They just give you a score. So, for example, if you want to talk about the time when you caught your best friend cheating on an exam and they asked you, tell me about a problem you had to overcome, you could talk about your friend cheating on the exam and that was a major problem and how did you overcome it? And then the next station could ask you, tell me about something that shows you can respond to situations as they arise. Well, I was taking this exam when I looked over and saw my best friend cheating. And you tell the story and you had to talk about how you had to respond to that, as it was happening. So again, like this way you don't have to memorize answers. You just have to practice telling certain stories. Like if you can come up with 5 or 10 stories about your life, practice telling that story really well where you get really comfortable sharing that story. Work out the irrelevant details, work in the details that, you think highlight the best of you, and then always listen to the question, think about what they're measuring in you, and then tell them at the end why that's applicable, why you understand that question is important. And so that's, the behavioral interview questions are a good thing to prepare for either traditional or MMIs. And you can do that, um, like I said, with just about any kind of question. It's more about your storytelling than it is about um, practicing questions. And so you can Google behavioral interview questions online and find a bunch. You can also Google MMI interview questions and find a bunch of examples. And then so there's two other kinds of MMI questions, the SJT, and they're doing less of this in a virtual space, but in the past, they would actually have paid actors and actresses come in and perform and put you in really tough situations to test your sense of I guess, your ability to handle being yelled at, your ability to handle someone crying in front of you. And so rather than ask you about a situation on a screen, they will put you in a situation and watch you respond to it. They'll record you and see how you react to the situation. And so those are fun because you have to perform, you have to be in character the whole time. Like I said, I don't know how much they're doing that this year. Last year, virtual interviews were done on such a fly because of COVID. This year, they've had time to prepare, so maybe they're going to be better at you know having harder stations for you. I find SJTs for interviews to be amazing. I think they're great. I personally would love to see how someone responds to a difficult situation before they become a doctor because that's very real, right? Like in medicine, you're going to get yelled at, you're going to have people crying, and it would be good to see who can handle that and who can't handle that um, when it comes to getting into med school. So I wouldn't be afraid of them. Just have confidence in your ability to handle distress, right? Handle difficult people and think about ahead of time, think about how do I respond when I see somebody who is upset? How do I respond when someone is upset with me or when they're yelling at me? Typically, I find people who've worked in customer service to do much better at those. So if you've ever worked at a coffee shop or at a retail store, do much better at your MMIs than someone who's never had a job working with people. And then the last kind of question is like an ethical question where they'll say, tell me argue whether medical marijuana should be illegal across the country, or you have a patient who's refusing the vaccine, talk them into create a case for them about why they should take their vaccine. And so it's more of like a presentation of ideas and or a debate in the sense of like, tell me, either something you agree or disagree with about a topic. And it's usually an ethical topic or a current events topic related to medicine. And then some schools are doing the group panel interviews. That's where you're in a room with several other people. Sometimes they'll ask you specific questions about you. Sometimes they'll just ask the same question to everybody. Either way, I wouldn't worry too much about that. I think they're not going to ask you anything super personal in front of everyone. For ethical ones, I think, Madeline, I would be really comfortable talking about the main things, the main bioethics issues. You can Google bioethical issues for medical school interviews and come up with some. But generally, thinking about things like abortion, medical marijuana, immunizations, um, assisted suicide or physician-assisted suicide, and what else? Like, look at legislation right now, and you can look at legislation in the state or whatever state you're interviewing in and just see, like, what are some hot topics around healthcare right now? But those are things that I would be comfortable with. And make sure you don't just study your side of the view. Make sure you're studying both sides of any perspective. If they say to you, I want you to argue that abortion should be illegal in America, right? You might be very pro choice and you might be thinking, well, I don't actually think it should be. And so you might be thinking, I can't answer this question because that's not what I think. Well, truthfully, in medicine, you don't get to insert your own personal beliefs into your care. You have to do whatever the law says. So if the law says that you have to, not do the blood transfusion on this baby because the parents have said it violates their religious beliefs, and you have to stand there and watch the baby die, that's the law. You can't say, I don't agree with this. I personally believe it should be done, and you don't get to override what the law says. So having respect for kind of being told what you should and like what you have to do, I think is maybe a secondary skill they're learning in this. If they tell you to argue something, it doesn't matter what you personally believe. They're telling you to argue it, you argue it, and you don't insert your personal beliefs into the situation. Do whatever they tell you to do and do it to the best of your ability. And definitely don't tell them you can't answer a question because it violates your personal beliefs. Like, I've actually had people do that with me in the past, like refuse to answer a question because it triggers them or it does something, upsets them in some way. I think that that's going to be a problem for most med schools because these issues like abortion, like that's a medical issue, right? That's patients are, if you're depending on what field you're in, are going to want to talk about that. And you have to be able to talk about things with patients. And so you got to be able to do that. Okay, so I think I've talked about open and closed. If they tell you in the invite that it's an open interview, it means that the interviewers are going to see everything about you and can potentially ask you anything they want from your application. A closed interview generally means they don't see your metrics, or a semi-closed just means that they don't see your metrics, but they see your secondaries and your personal statement. Um, Yep, so this kind of summarizes what I had just talked about. Think of lots of examples from your past, practice telling stories, learn everything about a school before your interview so you can try to tie it back to the school, use specific references to the school if you can, and then you want to tie it back to medicine if you can. And if you can do that every time with every question, I think that you'll be in good shape. So, yep, I just said that.
Kathleen has a question. Do they tell you
Yeah.
if it will be open or closed?
Not always. I'm not sure if it matters 100% if you think so MMIs are generally closed 100%. They don't usually have your application for MMIs. For individual interviews, they may tell you. Personally, I would assume, even if it is an open interview, I would go into the interview assuming they have not read your application, because I know when I ran interview days, I would give the interviewers the applications a week in advance, and many of them did not read the applications before they arrived because they were busy and just didn't do that. So you can assume they have not read it, and then if they end up bringing something up, then they did. In that case, you don't have to provide as much background information in your answers. But if they ask you a question and it's something that you talked about in your application, you would still go ahead and tell them. You wouldn't just say, oh, well, that's in my application. You want to answer the question, tell them whatever information you provided in your application. Um, if you and you should definitely have questions prepared for the schools. Have a lot of questions because you might have, 2 or 3 interviews, and so you want to have a couple of questions per interviewer. But make sure you're tailoring those questions to the person who's interviewing you. So, for example, if you have questions about how financial aid works, or um, anything like kind of technical like that, and you're meeting with a faculty, you wouldn't ask the faculty about that, right? They don't know anything about the administrative side of it. Just like if you're meeting with a student, you wouldn't ask them about, um, how, I don't know, I guess you could ask them about assessments, but you just make sure you're asking questions that make sense for the person. Think about what they would know, and do that. Don't ask about the person, like about them personally. Don't say like, well, what's your background or what's your story? Why did you decide to go into medicine? Because that's just killing time, but it's a waste of space because what are you gonna do with that information? So now you understand why one more person went into medicine, but that doesn't actually teach you anything about the school. You're there to try to figure out if this is a med school that you would like to go to. That is your only purpose for being there. You're not there to make friends or to learn about a person. You're not there to be inspired. You're there to figure out if you had 2 choices between 2 med schools, why would you pick this one? But I would not ask them to tell you why you should pick that school. That is also equally as annoying. And so if you just say like, tell me why I should pick this school if I get accepted, they're gonna be like in their mind rolling their eyes because they're gonna be like, I don't want to tell you everything about our school. It's on our website. Like, ask them very targeted questions. So you could say, so I know you all have the problem-based learning curriculum. Can you tell me a little bit about any changes that you've made to the program over the years? Are there any projected changes that are going to be made to the curriculum model in the next couple of years? Or if you know that they have student-run clinics, you could say, what percentage of the students participate in the student-run clinics? Or is it possible, how feasible is it as a first-year med student to participate in the student-run clinics? If you want to do research, you could say, what percentage of your first year students get research stipends between their first and second year? Do any of those first year med students doing research ever go abroad and do research? So, think about things they have and ask them very specific questions. Don't just make them tell you everything about their school. That's such a daunting task and it's exhausting. It's your job to be doing the work in this process. Okay. Doug has told me that we have to wrap it up, so I'm going to quickly just give you like some sample questions. We are not going to have time to do what I wanted to do, which have you answer them. So everyone should have a decent answer to tell me about yourself, which I have found always needs coaching. I have never met a person who can answer this question well in their first try. Make sure you practice. Someone asked, is it okay to ask about residency? As long as the person who you're talking to would have that information, but you can usually find their residency placements on their website. And keep in mind that residency placement doesn't always equate to your chances of getting into a specific residency. It just means that um, nobody in their class chose to do that. Um, why do you want to be a doctor? That's a good one. That's similar to, it's different than the value you bring. If they ask you, why do you want to be a doctor? I would, like, a lot of people want to just talk about their journey story, like how did they decide to be a doctor, that moment in time. I would argue only half of your answer should be that, how did you decide to be a doctor, and then the second half needs to go to the future. So now that you've decided to be a doctor based on who you are, what is it that you want to do with your future? Why do you want to wake up every day and go to work and do that job? If someone were to ask me, like, why do you want to be a pre-med advisor, I wouldn't tell you the story about how I decided to go and apply for this job to be a pre-med advisor, right? I would tell you about why I like to do the job, why I like, what problems I want to solve, what are my goals with doing this job? Like, what do I hope to accomplish in doing this job? It's all centered and it's all focused on the future, right? Not on my past. So anytime someone's like, why do you want to do something? It's because you should have a goal in your mind. You should have a vision for your future, not necessarily like hovering and, walking through every decision you made to get to this point of applying. They might ask you, why us? That's a really basic question you should have a good answer for every school. I wish I had more time. This is that kind of ethical question I asked about. I actually had someone come back and tell me one time, it's been a few years, that they were asked to do this. That's where I got the idea to ask it in my practice questions, because it was a real question a few years ago. And then just some logistical stuff. You will schedule your interviews online most likely. They may give you lots of options, which sometimes they're far out. Like you might be able to schedule your interview 2 months out, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes they give you like 2 days notice. And if that's the case, there's kind of nothing you can do about it. You just schedule the interview and then you hustle and try to get some help as fast as possible. You could try and call them and ask if you can get a different date, but if they only have 1 or 2 dates online, more than likely that's all they have available. You could always, if your interview is like 3 months away, you could always call and ask to be put on a wait list for an earlier spot, and that will most likely happen. People drop off their interview dates all the time. So that's possible. It's more likely to get an earlier date than to push it off later. And truthfully, you probably wouldn't want to push your interview off later. It kind of sends a message of like, I'm not really excited about interviewing at your place, right? If unless you say like, well, I have a final that day, that makes sense. But if you're just like, oh, I can't interview in 2 days, it's too short a notice, I'm too nervous, that would be terrible. I wouldn't say that to a med school. Come up with a better reason. Okay, I'm going to stop there and very quickly ask if anybody has any questions before I hand it back over to Doug. Oh, that was a lot. I have to take a deep breath. Any questions?
Remember, you can also use your microphones. That tends to go a little bit faster.
Okay, I guess I was extremely thorough. That's okay. If you don't have any questions, how does secondary fees work? If you have fee assistance, more than likely all the schools will waive the secondary fees for you. So that's super nice. Interviews can go all the way through May. So most people get invited to interviews around August. Let me back up. Most people do not get invited to interviews in August. Some people get invited to interviews in August. Most people get invited to interviews, between like November and February. People have this expectation that as soon as they get submitted and they're complete, that the interviews are just going to start rolling in. That rarely happens. It happens for some people, but most people, they kind of trickle in over a long period of time, which is extremely nerve-wracking and destroys the whole self-confidence, mental health thing when it comes to med school. So you just try to get a job or 2 or 3, stay really busy, try to distract yourself from, refreshing your email every 15 seconds. It's really hard, but that's the best I can tell you, is to just stay busy so you keep your mind off of the process. You should apply for a FAP before you register for the MCAT, because it does give you a discounted MCAT registration fee and MCAT materials. So it's good for, if you apply for it, like let's say January 1 of 22, let's say, it's good until December 31st of 23. It's good to the end of the year, the next year.
When it opens to apply, usually is not quite January 1st, but it's like a little bit later in the year, usually around end of January, beginning of February. Tal.
Madeline, it just depends on if you plan on using your UC Davis email. You can use whatever email you want, but something you check often and you'll have access to. Okay, well, I really appreciate everybody's great questions. And if you need any help, if you're a UC Davis student, feel free to come to drop-ins and we can help you with that. If you're not a UC Davis student, I am posting some tips on my Instagram page about different things. Feel free to follow me on Instagram. And otherwise, see if you can find who your pre-health advisor is at your institution. And make sure you get help for all of this. This is, like I said, not a very intuitive process, and you are going to want to get some feedback when it comes to secondaries and interviews. All right, take care,
Joanne,
everybody.
do you know how long UC Davis students get to keep their emails after they graduate?
It's a while. It's like years. It's not. I don't think it's a matter of months.
Oh.
I think. I mean, I still interview people from UC Davis who graduated who are like 3rd, 4th year med students right now, who are at other schools in other states, and I still email their UC Davis email and they respond to me.
It's definitely not 30 days, sorry.
Yeah, no, I don't think so. I think it's longer than that. You can double check with the IT department though. I mean, I am not claiming to be an expert on that topic whatsoever.
All righty. Well, thank you,
Alright.
Joanne, for the interviews and secondaries discussion today. That was very thorough. Thank you for all that. We are going to wait. Is that a typo, Joanne? Joanne.snap.advising?
No, that was just my Instagram page. If anybody wants to
Oh,
follow
okay.
me for tips, sorry.
Gotcha. I thought that was an email address. All righty. Thank you for that. And we're going to take a short break here. We'll take about 10 minutes and we'll let our presenter Kenneth Brand, I almost said Kenneth Branagh. No, Kenneth Brenner, who's going to be talking to us a little bit about cars today. So let's take 10 and we'll come back at 10:55 and we'll get started with some cars discussion today. Thank you, Joanne. Yay. All righty. Looks like at least a handful are back. That's good. All right. So Kenneth Brenner is here from Princeton Review, and he's going to teach you a little mini lesson from cars. And it looks like it's on the process of elimination in cars. So let's give him your attention. Make sure to ask questions. You can either use your mics or raise your hand or use the chat box. And if he seems to miss something in the chat box, I can help transmit the question onto him. Although I know the Princeton Review teachers tend to have an eye on the chat box all the time. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Kenneth.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Douglas. Thank you for that introduction. And good afternoon, everyone. Yes, I am watching the chat as I present, but I will be thankful for the help if I miss anything. So as Douglas said, my name is Ken. I've been with Princeton Review for about 13 years now. And my goal here over the next hour and 5 minutes or so is to give you insight into what many people believe is the hardest section on the MCAT, and to give you what I consider to be one of the principal weapons you have at your fingertips to make that section a little bit more straightforward and manageable. I think the reasons that people find cars hard are kind of obvious. You'll spend your whole undergraduate career perfecting your knowledge of bio, physics, G-Chem, Orgo, Biochem, Psych, and Soc, right? And 3 of the 4 sections on your MCAT, which are part of the admissions process, along with all of the application and med school research that Joanne and Douglas have covered. 3 of the 4 sections of this test, the MCAT, are all going to be based on your science knowledge. It's the application of your knowledge rather than rote memorization, but undergrad prepares for you pretty well. And if I know my content well, it's really unlikely that I would do poorly unless I don't manage my time. But cars is a different beast. Cars is a section that lasts 95 minutes and has 9 passages with 5 to 7 questions each for a total of 53 questions. And unlike the other areas, these questions are based on the humanities and the social sciences. So you might easily go from a passage about the bear's history as a spiritual symbol to the 4 stages of child development, right back to the definition of playful incongruity as it developed in the American West in the 19th century. It is a hodgepodge. And the fact that it is all based on critical analysis and reasoning of reading passages, there's no outside knowledge, there's no science content, it is really, really tricky. I focus on process of elimination as a reminder to you all that the MCAT is a fully multiple choice exam. There is no short answer, no essay, no writing component. And so if there are 4 answers to each question, while it's true that 1 of them are right, the fact is 3 of them are flawed. Your ability to catch those flaws will dramatically increase your CARS score and therefore your MCAT score overall. Now, to help you with that, I want you to consider this situation. You walk up to the closet in your bedroom and you say, "Today I am cleaning out the closet." If you approach it with this question, "What am I keeping?" You guys can answer in the chat. If you say, "What am I keeping?" what will wind up happening? If I walk up to go clean out a closet and I ask, "What am I keeping?" the sad end result of your attempt to clean out your closet will be what? Awesome. Thank you, Beatrice. You're going to wind up keeping everything. You need to approach the MCAT as, what 3 things am I getting rid of? And you will find that if you approach your closet and the MCAT that way, you will assemble at least 3 items that you actually remove. So as we go through this miniature lesson, that's going to be our spirit. We're not going to be concerned with the one answer that's right as much as we're going to be concerned with the 3 answers that are flawed. When you get to an MCAT CARS question, there will be 5 steps to attacking it. And those are going to be, what type of question am I dealing with? How can I translate it to make it an easier task? Where in the passage do I need to go to find the answer? What should the answer do or say based on what I saw in the passage? And finally, POE, or the process of elimination. So the way that we talk about process of elimination is, once you do all of the work of reading the passage, reading the question, and rereading, it's so critical that right at the end, right when you're going to select an answer, you don't allow yourself to become distracted and get sent away from what you thought would have been correct. The way you avoid distractors is learning what the distracting answers are. And in fact, we'll get to this, what we call the wrong answers are on the MCAT, on CARS anyway, is we call them attractors because they attract you to them, but are ultimately distractions for the right answer. By understanding that your job is to eliminate the 3 bad answers and choose the least bad option, it is one of the ways, or the least wrong, it's one of the ways we aim to kind of improve. So, in order to properly do POE, the process of elimination, we're going to say we do POE in what is called 2 cuts. First, read all 4 answers word for word with an open mind. Do not choose an answer before you have read all of them. Avoid falling in love with an answer because attractors will make themselves more appealing but will be wrong. Try to first eliminate the answers that contradict what the passage said. There's a few exceptions to this. If they want to know all of the following except or what would weaken the passage, then you want to keep answers that contradict what was going on in the story. But there's going to be 1 or 2 answers that are so far off base, we will get rid of them. Remember that I'm going to show you today how you come up with your own answer. And your own answer will help you eliminate what's really inconsistent. And finally, whenever you're trying to figure out what's wrong with each answer, we are not allowed to say, "I don't remember reading it," or "that doesn't sound good." You've got to give a specific reason for why an answer is flawed. What often happens is a lot of you guys, without me saying a word, are probably successful on the first cut in any practice work you've done. It is the second cut that winds up being relevant here. The first thing you have to do when you're trying to pick between two or maybe three choices is reread your question stem. Why? Because it's likely, though not possible, not definite, that one of the flawed answers is failing to address the question's issue or task. Then compare them to each other. Is one of the answers more extreme than the other? Is it saying something that is more off base or maybe even offensive? Third, if you need to return to the passage a second time, do so with the intent of, looking at the differences you found in the previous step and eliminating them. And finally, learn your attractors and pick the least wrong answer. So, how can I summarize this? In the first cut of POE, you're eliminating the answers that are completely off base for the chunk of the passage you read. In the second cut, I'm checking my stem again. I'm checking my two answers in comparison to each other. I'm returning to the passage if needed to highlight the differences, and I am applying my attractors. So, the attractors, as I said, attract you to them, but are ultimately the wrong answer. And this is for all of you who say, I get it down to two, and then I pick the wrong one. And this is, I don't know if you guys know the fish, but this particular fish has this appendage that is a light that will essentially will work like a lure to other fish. And then little do they know, they thought they were going to eat and they become the meal. So there's your nightmare fuel for the day. And I will just move on. In one spot, I would like to go over with you the main types of attractors. And the first and most common type of attractor are what we call the decoys. The decoys share one thing in common. Decoys misrepresent the passage text. And I bet you're wondering, well, I'd love to know how many of them there are. Sure. There are 7 decoys on the MCAT. And easily the most famous of them is words out of context. This type of decoy takes exact wording from the passage and misuses it in the answers. It really penalizes those who try to match words. And the number one way you'll catch a words out of context trap is double check any exact language, right? Whenever you see words that are identical to the words the passage used, you shouldn't be excited about that. You should say, wait. Are they trying to screw me? And the odds are, yes, they are. The second decoy, and I think I'll have to make each one of these smaller just so they kind of fit. The second decoy that is also incredibly common is half right, half wrong. These answers have an entire half or maybe even 2/3 of the answer that is actually correct. But if you read every word of the answer choice, including all the way to the end, you will find that the second half goes askew of the passage. These answers punish anyone who reads the answers too quickly, or if an answer looks good, will stop reading. There's also the right answer to the wrong question. These answers are true, but are not supported by, but don't answer the question. So to get these, this is the second cut of POE thing. It's going to be reread the question task carefully. So yeah, AAMC will literally include answers that that are absolutely true based on the passage, but fail to address the question task. The next two are similar. We have reversals. Reversals take a relationship in the passage and literally, well, reverse it. So they might say, well, the husband neglected the wife. And the answer will say, so the wife neglected the husband. So make sure you go back to the passage and understand the chronology of your relationships. The fifth one is opposites. Don't worry, I'll stop for questions soon. Opposites take what the passage said and they include a word of negation like no or not. So check your answers for words of negation that check your answers for little words of negation. So the author might have said, this group likes living in New York City. And the answer might have said, this group does not like living in New York City. And it is only the little word not that throws the answer off. Your sixth decoy, now we're getting less common, is the wrong point of view. The answers can include a opinion that somebody else had in the story, right? And that and attribute it to the author or a different character. So when you go back to the passage, check for the speaker. And finally, we have garbled language. These answers are the rarest decoy. I've tried to put them in the order in which they'll show up. These are the rarest decoy. These feature language that is so hopelessly warped that a student will pick it because it sounds very professional. These answers tend to use sophisticated vocabulary from the passage and they sound smart. Make sure, this is true for all decoys, you are matching the meaning of the words, not the words themselves. These are very similar to words out of context, except these might use the word correctly. They might just use it 7 times and not make any actual sense. Now, look, I'm not expecting everyone here in attendance today to say, cool, I've got these 7. It's more important that you're able to just identify an answer as a decoy. All 7 of these take the exact language of the passage or the exact point the passage is making, and they misuse it. And they're most common on questions that are asking you to go back and look up data or make inferences from the story. Now I'm going to do a part 2 of this, and I'm going to get to all of them before I expect you to use them later. But does anyone have any questions about these 7 decoys before we move on? And don't worry, I'm assuming questions are going to be coming once we get to the sample passage. So let me see if I can get that in the chat for you, so it's still there, even as we move forward. All right, almost there, guys. I promise you're going to see this used in a moment. There are 2 more types of attractors. There is a category called the extremes, and there's a category called the out of scopes. So let's talk about them, because again, this is like fun. The first extreme that you're going to see is going to be language that is an absolute. Absolutes use words like always or never or must. They sound impactful, but they go far further than the passage ever would. Think about the authors of these passages, right? They are respected professionals in their field. A professional person wouldn't make a wild, one sided, narrow claim. They would make a slightly gentler, more broad one. So the way you're going to catch absolutes is you are going to check for words like always and never and make sure that the passage actually went to those lengths. Similarly to absolutes are superlatives. So check for words ending in est. Authors don't call something the best, or st, let's call it, the best or the worst or the nicest or the meanest. Everything is measured on the exam. You also need to watch out for judgments and comparisons. SAT author, SAT, my goodness, MCAT authors almost never, almost never say, like, I like this thing better than that thing, or I think this group is inferior. So check for opinionated or offensive language, or I think there's probably a better word for this than judgments. Not qualifications. We'll leave it as judgments. Check for opinionated or offensive language, or like an overly strong show of preference. And finally, guys, the last extreme is the other direction, too weak. Too weak answers are answers that are so basic and neutered that they don't do anything to the passage. These show up on strengthen and weaken questions. Look for answers that would not affect the passage at all. Oh, I was trying to say judgments or recommendations. I could not remember the word. The author, for instance, guys, might like something, but that doesn't mean she's going to recommend that you go do something with it. Just because the author prefers living on the West Coast, an answer saying she wants everyone to move to California or to Oregon would not be right. That's what I mean by judgments and recommendations. And finally, guys, and don't worry, this is all getting to a point, we have our out of scopes. The biggest out of scope is simply not the issue. These answers were never mentioned by the passage. So go back to the passage and make sure the topic was discussed. The next out of scope is going to be no such comparison. This one is where two items that the passage brought up are in the answer, but the author never compared them. So look for comparative words and make sure that if the answer has the comparative word, the author actually made that comparison and didn't just mention those two things. The third one of these is outside knowledge. Are you only saying the answer is right because you know that it's true in the real world? Make sure the passage supported it. When you go back to the passage, you need to look for evidence of the answer that is not from your head. The fourth one of these out of scopes, we are going to call the crystal ball. MCAT authors do not predict the future. So watch out if your answer mentions the future or predicts it. These authors are professional people. They do not speculate like that. And the last one, and this shows up specifically on main idea questions, is an answer that is too narrow or too broad. On main idea questions, look, check the scope of each answer and make sure it's on the same level that the passage was. That was a lot. Everyone was like super patient. I'm going to show you these in action. Have no fear. Last time I'll say that. But does anyone have any questions and needs any more clarity on the 16 attractors I just threw out for you? So what's a good summary for those of you who want this boiled down to one thing? The right answer will paraphrase the passage correctly, avoid extreme statements, and be supported by evidence from the text. A wrong answer will violate at least one of those conditions. Everyone good so far? Cool. Some people are like, this is too much. Other people, anyone who's a list maker out there, will love having all of these in one place. But hey, let's actually do a passage. Okay. I want to show you guys how we're going to work through a CARS passage. The first thing you guys need to do is figure out if this is a passage we should do now or later. And the way we're going to do that is using something called personal order of difficulty. And what I want us to examine, and by the way, this is the actual first step I would take on a passage, is I'd like you guys to examine the vocabulary, the sentence structure, and the concept of the first 3 sentences. So follow along with me here. This passage says, it was like a news explosion. The pace had been so slow before Roosevelt, so relaxed and genteel. Washington, after all, was not that big a dateline. Guys, would you describe the level of those vocabulary words as fairly basic or extremely complicated? I agree with Courtney. Let's talk about the sentence structure. Are those fairly simple sentences, or does he keep interrupting himself with like semicolons and buts and howevers and stuff? Are the sentences fairly straightforward, or is the structure very complex? A lot of semicolons, buts, howevers. What would you guys say? Okay, it was like a news explosion. The pace had been so slow before Roosevelt, so relaxed and genteel. These are very, very like simple sentences. And then the concept. Guys, the concept here is the pace of news had been slow before Roosevelt. And then after Roosevelt, it exploded. Would you guys call that concept concrete or abstract? Thank you again. Awesome. It is concrete. That is something I could explain to a younger person. It was the pace of news was slow. This major figure was elected, and now it's much faster. This is then a passage that you would do immediately. But if the vocabulary was complex, if the sentence structure was complicated, and the idea was abstract, you would save this for the end. So that's a weird idea. But jumping around the 9 passages and doing all the easier ones first is a huge weapon, because you're earning all the points you should early. Let's keep at it. There's a lot going on in this passage, but what we're interested in is quickly looking at our questions. To know what we're going to be asked about, we need to find some of what we call our key words. One of the things we're looking for is a description of the pre-Roosevelt journalists, according to question 7. In question 6, we'd love to know where they bring up the 1920s. In question 5, it might be interesting to learn what they say about crime reporters. Question 4 is something I've already found. I know that I'm looking for information about the pre-Roosevelt journalists already. I'm not going to note that again. In question 3, I'd love to know what they say about Houlihan. In 2, there's really nothing that I'm going to be able to find from that question. And in 1, I already know that I'm looking for reporters before Roosevelt. This, guys, is a checklist. The 1920s, the pre-Roosevelt reporters, the crime reporters, and I already said the 1920s, the crime reporters and Houlihan. It's a big deal. 6 of my 7 questions focus on these topics. This little preview helps how we're going to work the passage. Now, normally there's more to this, but for the sake of today, I'm just going to find these terms with you guys. Let's go back to our passage. Take a look. I'm talking about before Roosevelt in paragraph 1. This might be where they bring up the reporters before Roosevelt. Does anyone see what else from the list might be showing up in passing paragraph 1? The list is in the chat. Awesome. Thanks, Laura. They talk about Houlihan a few times. And on the test, you can highlight. So I'm going to highlight all of my words that I know are part of my question. Cool. Let's look at paragraph 2. In paragraph 2, they bring up Houlihan a few more times, but I want everyone to look carefully because they do bring up another one of our terms here. They bring up the pre-Roosevelt reporters and Houlihan again, right? The late 20s, very good. There's actually more. It doesn't exactly say crime reporters, but I bet you can find something like it. In this second paragraph, they mention, right, these other reporters who covered murders and other police stories. So a lot of our stuff winds up being here. So as you're going along, you're saying, well, what are these paragraphs about? The first paragraph is talking about how the pre-Roosevelt reporters were all like, they were all, very like leisurely, they wore walking sticks, they were properly dressed. The second paragraph continues that. These are people who dress a certain way. They distinguish themselves from crime reporters by what they wear. They're more serious. They even have presidents attending their funerals. The third paragraph furthers the description of these guys. And what you'd be doing as you're trying to highlight is you'd just be trying to understand loosely what's going on in each paragraph. Here, it's talking about how they don't like to rush, and the telephone is a discourteous, and all the new traffic is inconvenient. In the fourth paragraph, in the last paragraph here, right? It talks about one of the stops they make, and it explains how they're able to just walk in. So here is what your note board, which is lined laminated graph paper that you write on with a wet erase pen, that is given to you at your MCAT. Here's what it might look like. In paragraph 1, the reporters before Roosevelt dressed professionally and had a leisurely style. In paragraph 2, we might say they separated themselves from other reporters and took the profession seriously. In paragraph 3, you'll see this in a second. They did not rush and considered the telephone discourteous and traffic inconvenient. And paragraph 4, they had free access to the White House and could walk in, with like little security. So guys, if you had to tell me, could anyone take a crack at what the bottom line of this passage is? What would you say is the main point here? What's the main thing this author wanted you to understand? You don't have to type it. You can come on mic too. But all these paragraphs are pointing to one overall point. The goal of this passage, you guys might say, is what? It's okay. There's often some uncertainty when it comes to cars, or maybe people taking some time to think through it. We want to be very, very, very straightforward. The goal here is just going to be to describe the news reporters before Roosevelt and show how they were professional, stylish, and courteous. That's really all the passage is seeking to do. So how does this all come together? Why did we need to do this? Well, without the passage, I think the questions I was about to ask might have confused people, but also some answers will be eliminated simply because they don't match our bottom line. Let's spend our time together now and attack some questions. The pre-Roosevelt journalists described in the passage valued all of the following except the way we're going to BOE here is eliminate the word except. We'll strike it through. And I would love for you guys to type in the chat which of these four answers had proof in the passage. This question is making us is asking us to make a conclusion, and it wants to know which conclusion is not correct. What I'd like to hear from you guys, you can just type the letter. I'd like to know which of these conclusions are correct based on what I took you through. Excellent. Choice A is part of paragraph 2, and being courteous is part of paragraph 3. And again, part of why I jumped to the questions at this point is we can't see the passage, but if we know that they dress a certain way and they're putting distance between themselves and other types of reporters, and they've got presidents attending their funerals, could anyone tell me the other answer that's right here? Awesome. Thanks, Courtney. These three are all backed up by parts and Laura of different paragraphs, right? So where does B fall? It is the odd man out, and it is the answer we would select here. And notice it has a couple of problems. Most is a superlative. It's an extreme. But this is also the opposite of the passage. If they made the most efficient use of the time, they would rush. According to the passage, do these guys rush? No, they're professional, but they go about their day leisurely. Cool. So here we're seeing some attractors and how together they could create a problem. Number 6, it can be inferred from the passage that in the 1920s, once again, we have an inference question. Let's learn the two things the passage says about the 1920s. First, you've got Croswell Bowen showing up, and he deliberately wore a style that was in part rumpled and seedy, but he had quickly gotten the message and soon was appearing with a fedora and a walking stick. The other time the 20s shows up, sorry that I missed this underline, is here. In the 20s in Washington, the Indian story was a big one. Indians were one of the few major concerns of the federal government. Traveling as a group, the reporters, would go on to the War Department building, right? Sometimes they saw this guy, they went to the White House to see the president. There was no need for the White House credentials. Everyone knew everyone else. So, guys, what might we say? In the 1920s, right? The news reporters were expected to dress a certain way. And they could walk right into the White House. These are the major things that happened in the 20s, according to the passage. Let's look at our answers then, right? Are there any answers you guys would eliminate? And for each one, we'll try to understand what the attractor would be. If you remember the attractor list and want to try it yourself, you can always give me the one in the chat. First, as Courtney says, and I hope I'm saying that right, we have A. This is outside knowledge. You might independently know that in the roaring 20s, the economy was doing well, but the passage never says it. Any others, folks? C, it is true that the it is true that the news reporters don't like the telephone, but there's not widespread resistance to using it. What's the other flaw? I'll, like I did, I'll type our predictions in the chat so you've all got that reference point. There's another bad answer here for certain, though. Awesome. What's wrong with D? I'll start throwing those questions to you guys. You can give me the word, you can give me the attractor, you can hop on mic and explain. Yeah, this is the opposite of the passage. They could, in fact, walk right in. See, you didn't even need to show credentials. And so the right answer here is B. We know national security was not a major concern. One of the few major concerns was the problem with the Indians, the Native Americans, but also you could walk right into the White House. So cool. Let's keep at it. Which one of the following does the passage imply about crime reporters? This is another inference question. It's the most common question type. And we want to go in the passage and find out what it says about the crime reporters. So it says, sorry, let me get to the right passage. That was sad. There we go. They were the cream of a new crop of journalists. They covered the activities of dignitaries, and their clothes, as much as anything else, put some distance between themselves and other reporters, those who covered murders and other police stories. So, guys, not the crime reporters, but how did the national news reporters dress? The national news reporters are the they from the early part here. Yeah, they dressed more formally, right? So we can say they dressed more formally than the crime reporters. That is the comparison between the two. That's our prediction. So we go to our question then, right? If the national news reporters dress more formally than the crime reporters, which of the following is a good conclusion about crime reporters? Better yet, guys, which answer, you right? A is the answer that would be a good conclusion. So we keep this answer. Let's look at these other options. B, they were more serious before Roosevelt. This is not discussed. We have no idea if crime reporters are more serious before Roosevelt. Calling them vulgar and impersonal is a judgment. And they disparaged the fancy knowledge that the national reporters were inclined to wear. This is an outside knowledge trap, right? It's a trap because we might expect the lower status group to resent everything about the upper status group, but it's like that's true in the real world. It's not supported by the passage. as Courtney says, your best answer here is A. It flipped the ordering of our relationship, but it's the right relationship. Number 4, the passage portrays journalists before Roosevelt's time as, now this is about the whole passage. We have a bottom line, right? And so if we look, our prediction here, since this question's so general, is just going to be our bottom line. Literally, like what does it say? And so again, you've got another, if you haven't caught this already, the most common question you get asked is to draw a conclusion from the passage. Which answers, now that you guys see the bottom line in the chat, which answers are wrong? There's only a couple here. B is one of the really wrong answers. No idea is an absolute. And we have no idea, like, we don't know that their idyllic world is about to be radically changed. It's never mentioned. So we might also say this is not the issue. It's not discussed how aware they are of the change. There's another answer here that I think would definitely be wrong. Yeah, a lot of people will go and say D. What, and this is again probably just because we didn't read every last word. There is at least one thing that they're unhappy about, right? There's a recent invention they don't like. What is that? They don't like the phone. Also, they complain about how inconvenient the new traffic is. So let's look at some other answers then. Look at A. Guys, is it true that they're focused on appearances? Like, these guys care how they look, right? But are they not interested in making change in their profession? Good. This is a half right, half wrong answer. It's easy to go for, but when I read all the way to the end, it says they're deliberately making the passage more serious. And what's the other answer that's wrong then? It is never stated that they've got control over political leaders. Just because they can walk into the White House doesn't mean they control anybody. Let's keep rolling. The question is, once more, an inference question. What does Houlihan represent? So we jump back to our paragraphs, right? Houlihan and Roosevelt, they're ideals of the time. They're properly dressed men who wear fedoras and carry walking sticks. The walking sticks are symbols of more leisurely professions. They even wore starched shirts. And they were very distinguished. Houlihan's funeral has a president at it. So Houlihan represents the ideal. Respected, well-dressed, respected, well-dressed professional. That's what we might say. And now hopefully you're seeing the value. I know we spent some time highlighting stuff in the passage, but doing that makes it easier to find every other answer later. So, which of the 4 answers here, guys, would be wrong? And we would eliminate it of the 4. You can look at all of them. Good. We have no idea if he could not make the transition to the Roosevelt era. First of all, he died before it could happen, right? But second of all, this is completely, it's not mentioned. And it's also kind of like a prediction of the future. We have no idea if he would have been able to make the transition or not. What else is wrong? I think there's at least one other answer that's pretty off base. Awesome. You guys hit the big two. There is no gap discussed between the leisure class and politicians. I'll go one step further. This is an out of context trap. That is not how they use the word leisurely. Now look between A and D carefully. We are officially on the second cut of POE. You might be drawn to one of the answers more than the other, but try to be on the lookout for extreme language and absolutes. Any idea what the last bad answer is? The last trap, the last attractor? Very good, right? You guys are dead on, right? While he might represent an ideal to strive to, he is not an ideal for all reporters before and after Roosevelt. He is someone that the national news reporters before Roosevelt modeled themselves on. So what's the right answer? A. Things change so dramatically when you make it about what three answers are flawed. Which one of the following is a pair of symbols portrayed as opposites in the passage? This is again a super fun inference question where we're being asked to look up two things and figure out if they're opposites or not. The way you would do this problem is you would find these words where they appear in the passage. So guys, are the fedora, I'll underline these, I'll highlight these in a different color. Are the fedora and the starched shirt opposite symbols in the passage? No. These are in fact said to be the same. And so this answer, right, has, well, I could write opposite, I could write a reversal, but it is the opposite of their relationship. What about the walking stick and the automobile? The walking stick is one of the symbols of their professions. Do they complain about the automobile itself? They complain about traffic. This is an outside knowledge trap. It's the idea that, well, they like walking sticks and they complain about traffic. But we need to be very literal on this exam. Complaining about traffic doesn't mean you're complaining about cars. What about C? Are the traffic and telephone opposites in the passage? No way. These are both things the reporters dislike. So what is the answer? Excellent, guys. They like using the walking stick. It shows them as leisurely, as men of a certain elegance. They find the telephone discourteous. Cool. Last one. According to the passage, what can be said about reporters before Roosevelt? This is a retrieval question. Retrieval questions are just like inference questions. but they're even more to the point. Now, there's a couple of answers here that you guys can eliminate based on our bottom line. I'll grab the bottom line again. Let's talk again about eliminating stuff. What answers are wrong as a description of these guys? Good. A is a reversal of what is true in the passage. They don't have less access, they have more of it. Is there another one? Good. B is the exact same thing. They're not subject to greater control, they're subject to less. But now between C and D, someone might be stuck. They do desire to dignify their possession with personal style. They do aspire in manner and dress to a genteel and dignified ideal. But in our second cut of POE, we might focus on the idea of whether they're young men or not. Take a look back at the paragraphs, and I'll get you to the right paragraph, and you tell me if they are young men or not. They were in their 40s and 50s, right? And they were not young. This is an out of context trap where they actually say it was not a young man's beat. So the answer is C. And so, what can we say in summary? There are many, many different ways to handle passages. And I tried to show you today when we were working on the passage the things Princeton Review does. In order, we will quickly decide using the first 3 sentences, is this a passage we want to do? Then we'll check the question stems, knowing what keywords are coming up. Then we're going to work the passage, finding those keywords and summarizing each paragraph. Next, we're going to write down the bottom line. And lastly, we're going to attack the questions. And I tried to give us at least 30, 35 minutes or so on just attacking questions. And thank you for everyone who chimed in. When you get to attacking the questions, you want to say, what type of question is it and what am I being asked? Where in the passage should I go now that I found everything in steps 2 and 3? What should the answer look like? And then we POE. Some answers, like in this case, A and B, will be eliminated on the first cut, where they simply do not match the passage. Others will be eliminated on the second cut, where you really look for attractors, reread the question, compare the answers to each other, and go back to the passage. And I'll go to my list of attractors one final time. I really hope today gave you guys some insight as to how asking which 3 answers are wrong and knowing the different ways that it could be wrong might help you on your MCAT car section. Do you guys have any questions on the lesson as a whole, or any questions about cars or the MCAT structure in general before I wrap things up and pass them back to Douglas?
All righty. Well, it looks like there's no questions right now. So if you still have some questions remaining, go ahead and continue working on typing those in. So thank you, Kenneth, for stopping by and tell us a little bit about elimination tactics questions in the car section. That was very informative. For everybody else, this is the last of the formal sessions where we're holding presentations and whatnot. I did discover the video for session 6 was somehow not actually posted. It's like up there, but it's not made public. So we'll get that fixed up. We'll get recording for session 7 up there sometime this week. And for sessions 8 and 9, those are the mock MMIs next month and the mock MCAT the following month. We will be administering those via email. You'll get an email based upon your attendance to the sessions. Be advised that, like, technically you're supposed to have attended every session for the entire MedPrep program to be invited to those. I'm going to be giving some leeway to that because the attendance lists are a little bit wonky because of the way that we keep that Zoom keeps attendance. So I'm gonna have to like hand compare all the lists to make sure to see that who was here. So I'll probably not make it every session, but like probably more like half or more of the sessions, and you'll be invited to the mock exam and the mock MMIs. And so watch out for that email. It'll give you a link to a sign-up sheet so you can verify that you're coming and all the details and all that fun stuff. So other than that, thank you for making this a great MedPrep year, everybody. We start this program over again next October. So if you want to attend any that you might have missed this time around, feel free to do that as well. So thank you guys. If there's any questions, I can answer them now. Otherwise, have a great rest of your weekend. And with that, it was right at noon. So woohoo, we ended on time. Yay.